Okay, now you have to unmute yourself.
Alrighty, so we're picking up for the second part of the EarthKind training on soil analysis and preparation. Whoops, there we go. Okay, so I know you haven't had your soils lecture. Tell you what, I'm gonna stand up. I've got one of these standing desks. I just don't always use it. I'm gonna stand up instead of sitting down all day. Okay, hopefully everybody can still see me. Alrighty, so I know you haven't had your soils lecture yet, where you'll learn all about soils, what makes soil behave the way it does. Really, all you want to know, maybe a little more than what you'd ever want to know about soil, which is really important, of course, for any kind of horticultural thing you're doing. But just to kind of give you a little bit of a heads up, generally, if we could choose one type of soil, we would be looking for a sandy loam or a loam soil, okay? So that's unfortunately not what we have all the time. So what we tend to have are more the opposite ends of the spectrum, okay? So if you look at a sand, those of you who are in East Texas, you probably have a lot of sand, although it may be on top of that red sandy clay subsoil. Some parts of South Texas can have sand too, well, sand can be really anywhere, but you see a lot of it in East Texas, whereas we have the Blackland Prairie, which kind of runs through the I-35 corridor. A lot of the coastal plain is going to have, like a lot of Fort Bend County is going to have this heavy clay, this black clay. We'll see a lot of it in South Texas going out into Uvalde. A lot of the hill country has a soil that's fairly similar to this as well. And so when we look at sand, sand has some things going for it and sand has some problems, okay? Whenever we're growing something in soil, we want to make sure that we have plenty of air, plenty of oxygen for those roots, okay? Without getting too much into the details, plant roots are alive, okay? They are alive. They're essentially breathing. They're respiring just like us. If they get into situations where there's no air, the soil is saturated, there's no air, especially no oxygen in the soil, that's when you start to have problems. Now, since I know someone is going to ask, there are aquatic plants and they have a whole different mechanism. So that's kind of a different thing. So sand is good. Sand is good because we have lots of drainage. The water, whenever it rains or whenever we irrigate, we've got water there, but it quickly drains away. So we still have air in that soil. However, because of the way sand is structured, sand particles are really big. They're like these big boulders comparatively compared to other types of soil, okay? So what happens is that water drains through too quickly and we don't have much water left behind. So sand dries out quickly. It doesn't have good water holding capacity. Sand also does not hold nutrients very well. It's nutrient poor. It's fairly inert. And so we've got, on the one hand, it drains well, but on the other hand, it doesn't hold water and nutrients to the extent that we would like, okay? Now let's look at a clay soil because clay is kind of the opposite side of the spectrum, okay? Clay soil has tiny little microscopic particles. And so they're really close together and we have a lot of tiny spaces that hold water. So clay holds water very well. Because of the way the clay is structured chemically, it holds nutrients very well. So clay holds lots of water, lots of nutrients. But unlike sand, it holds too much water oftentimes. Water does not move through quickly enough. Water stays there too long. And so what that results in is poor root growth, and we can even get root rot and ultimately the death of the plant. So where we would like to be is somewhere in between, okay? We would like to be in what we call a sandy loam or a loam, okay? That's where we have a mixture of sand and clay and also another type of particle, which is kind of intermediate, called silt, okay? So that's going to give us the best of both worlds. We're going to have water and nutrient holding capacity, but we're still going to have drainage. And that's kind of what this is showing you here. We have in the Brazos River bottom, this nice, silty, sandy loam, but we don't have that in most places in Texas. So a lot of you are dealing with sand or clay. So we've got to work with this. It's not sustainable. It's not always feasible to haul in a bunch of nice sandy loam topsoil, but we can, through our EarthKind soil preparation techniques, we can improve the soil and make it act more like that sandy loam that we would like to have. Okay, so remember I told you clay, the problem is water stays around too long. We don't have enough oxygen in the soil. The roots die, the plant dies. That's what's going on here, okay? So you dig a hole, and if you got water in the bottom of it already, or you dig up a tree and it's got water in the bottom of the hole, that's not a good sign, okay? And so we see that a lot with clay. So here it is again, kind of from a different angle. So if we can actually visualize the type of soil we have based on the relative amounts of different particles, okay? So we've got sand here, okay? Sand, remember, they're these big boulders, basically. They're large, you can see the particles, whereas clay, they're tiny, microscopic, they hold nutrients and water really well. Silt is kind of in the middle, it's kind of intermediate. So depending on how much of these three particles we have will dictate what type of soil. So this is where, this is kind of where we would like to be, is in this area right here, okay? So a lot of people think, if you're in a clay soil especially, a lot of people think, well, man, I just need to add more sand. Let me add more sand and that'll move me, if I'm a cursor, down here toward that sandy loam, okay? Yeah, you can do that, but it takes an awful lot of sand to get there, okay? And if you do it incorrectly, you end up with concrete, okay? Which I've seen happen many times, okay? And so in any case, what we recommend doing is it's good to know what type of soil we have, what textural class we have, but we don't try to change the type of soil we have. We don't try to add more sand or more clay. We change the structure of the soil, okay? Structure is completely independent of texture. We're dealing with the same kind of soil. It's still clay, just like we had before, but what we're doing now is we are changing that soil so that it actually clumps together, okay? We want our clay, if you deal with a clay soil, you want it to kind of glue together into these little aggregates. These aggregates, we have these aggregates, these clumps of these tiny little clay particles, and when they stick together, they're going to act like sand. Now they're acting like bigger particles. We have these channels that open up, water moves through, we can get air in there. And so that's what we're looking for. We're improving structure. And that structure, essentially, we're just gluing these particles together into aggregates so they act more like a sand. Now, on a sandy soil, we have the opposite problem. Remember, the water moves right through. It doesn't hold nutrients very well. We can add organic matter like organic material like compost, and what that's going to do is it's going to clog up some of those spaces in the sand. The water is going to hang around longer, and that organic matter that's results from that is going to be able to hold a lot of nutrients too. Okay, so we're going for structure. We're changing the structure. We're not going to worry about this. So the way we do that is by adding organic material to the soil, okay? You can do peat moss, you can do leaves, there are many different sources, but what we recommend based on our research is the one-time incorporation of 3 inches of compost, okay? 3 inches, that's 3 inches. It's not 3 inches, not, really with compost, the more the better, but 3 inches we found is usually sufficient to improve the soil structure and give us about 1% organic matter in the soil. And that's going to do wonders. That'll allow you to hold about 30,000 gallons per acre more water, a lot more nutrients and everything, okay? So what you do is you see here in this picture, you get your compost and you till it in, you can spade it in, but get it in as deep as you can. Now, the type of compost is incredibly important. We don't want to use mulch. If you do this with mulch, you're going to end up with a lot of problems. Our horticulturist up in Denton County, Janet Laminack, did a really good job this past week talking about the difference between mulch and compost. And just FYI, we do Aggie Horticulture. We have a really active Facebook page, so check that out. Every week we have 2 different videos premiering on relevant, timely horticultural topics. And so check that out. She did one last week on compost and mulch. But we do this with a good, well broken down compost. We don't use mulch. We don't use wood shavings. We don't use sawdust. We use compost, which is broken down, okay? Now, what that's going to do, that's going to break down, that's going to provide structure, it's going to supply nutrients to the soil. If you think about compost, what is compost made out of? Compost is made out of decomposed plants. You may have manure in there as well. You have got most of the nutrients that the plants need already contained in that compost. Now, they're in an organic form most of the time. They're going to be available as a slow release form. So whenever you use compost, it's not the same thing as dumping a bunch of urea or ammonium sulfate or something like that on there. It's going to be slow releasing, but nonetheless, you are adding nutrients to the soil, okay? And so that's what it's going to do. Now, if you've been gardening for very long, you know that eventually what's going to happen is this compost, this organic matter in the soil is going to degrade, and eventually it's going to disappear. So if you're in a bed, if you've got a bed of, say, shrubs or some type of perennial plants, you know that you can't, it's not practical to go in there and till in more compost every couple of years, but that's okay. We can do that through mulch, okay? So what we recommend doing is adding, whenever we plant, a 3-inch, so it's easy to remember, 3 inches of compost, 3 inches of mulch, 3 inches of mulch on top of that soil. And usually we recommend a hardwood mulch. And we don't just do it once, okay? We come back, and as that mulch breaks down, as it gets thinner and thinner, we add it. We add to that to make sure at all times we have 3 inches of mulch there on top of that soil, okay? As that mulch breaks down, it's going to release organic matter, release nutrients to the soil. It's going to continue to feed that soil, okay? And you know what? We didn't make this up. This is not some new revelation. We are simply copying, we're emulating what nature does in the forests, where the soil is continually fed and recycling nutrients with that mulch, or for the forest, of course, it's leaves, okay? Alrighty, so when we get into clay soils that we have poor drainage, we can also benefit a lot from these raised beds, okay? So we pull our soil together. We may have to bring in a little bit of soil. We're pulling our soil together to where it's about 1 foot high generally, and kind of rounded up, crowned in the middle, gently sloping down toward the sides, okay? That's going to greatly improve drainage in clay soils. Now back to compost really quickly. Remember I told you don't use wood shavings, don't use mulch, use actual compost. There's a reason for that. If you look at the picture on the right, the one on the right is a good example of well broken down, what we call finished compost, okay? If you look at this and you try to discern what material this is made out of, it's kind of tough because it's broken down to the point where it's kind of, it looks like coffee grounds. I like Charlotte Anthony's description, our retired horticulturist here in Brazos County. It should look like coffee grounds. You can't really readily discern what it's made from. It should kind of smell like earthy. Shouldn't smell sour. It shouldn't be hot. If it's hot, it ain't done cooking. It's still composting. It needs to sit longer. Whereas this stuff on the left, this would be an example of a mulch or something that is still very raw, okay? And by raw, I just mean that whatever it's made out of, in this case, shredded wood, hardwood material, it's not broken down. It hasn't decomposed to the point where it's actually providing nutrients. It's actually sucking up, taking away nutrients if you put it into the soil. So if you till 3 inches of this into the soil, it'll eventually pay off, but it's going to take years. Until then, it's going to steal all the nitrogen, all the nutrients from the soil, whereas this is actually going to be like adding a slow release fertilizer. So make sure that your compost looks like this. If you're not sure of where to get it from, talk to the other master gardeners. Ask them some of the sources they recommend. And ideally, we could get this from a recycling facility. So again, we're taking that thrown away material and reusing it as a valuable asset in the landscape. Okay, I mentioned raised beds, okay? A raised bed is simply where we have the soil is elevated. So it's up about a foot higher. Remember I told you that clay soils, that the water stays around too long, and as they become saturated, the air is pushed out. And so then, you know, basically the plants, the roots actually drown essentially, okay? Well, if you have a raised bed like this, what's going to happen is this soil that's up high, it's higher than the surrounding grade. It's gonna allow for drainage. Okay, gravity is gonna pull that extra water out. So now we've got airspace in there again, and that's really, really going to help, especially if even just the top, the crown part of your shrub or whatever plant is up higher like that, is going to really, really, really help when it comes to root rot and disease and things like that. So raised beds, very helpful, especially if you're in a clay soil. Really a must if you're growing something like vegetables in a clay soil too. Now, what's cool about this is you could always line this. You could have it bordered by limestone rock or something like that, landscape timbers or dimensional lumber. But you could also have it made like this, where it's rounded in the middle like that. It's gently sloping, and then when you put that mulch on top of it, that mulch is going to shield it and protect it from washing away. It's going to hold it all together. So if you do this with the compost, you're going to really, really find that it's going to really improve your plant performance, especially in clay soils. Okay, so kind of as a review, what proper soil preparation is going to do. In clay soils, it's going to give us drainage. We're going to reintroduce air to that soil. And we do this without even changing the configuration, the composition of the soil. Remember, we're not adding sand, we're just adding organic material, which is going to give us that structure, okay? Now, conversely, in a sandy soil where we have the opposite problem, where we have water and nutrients that don't hang around long enough, we're going to help correct that by providing retention of water and nutrients. So what it's going to do, basically, it's going to make sand and clay soils both act more like that loam or that sandy loam that we would ultimately like to have. That organic material is going to be a slow release form of nutrients. Oftentimes in our studies, we found that it'll sufficiently provide the nutrients that the plants need. We may have to go in and add a little bit of something, maybe some nitrogen or something like that every once in a while, but it's going to be a lot less because we're adding nutrients with that recycled compost, and we're improving the soil's ability to hold those nutrients as well. Other big thing, and this is really helpful, is when you have a soil that's a lot looser, it's got better structure, those roots can go deeper and farther out. If you have a bigger root system, that root system can mine for nutrients and, more importantly, water a lot more effectively during a drought situation. So it's going to render it a lot more drought tolerant than otherwise. And then the other thing is I found with my PhD research is that it's also going to help a lot with buffering against soil problems. Like, for example, if you've got too high of a pH or too low of a pH, it's going to help to kind of buffer that pH, and it's also going to help against problems like salinity if you have too much sodium in your soil. Oh, another thing for some of you who are really into soil microbes and the soil microbiome, I took a class for my PhD at A&M called Root Biology, and some of you may think, oh gosh, that sounds terrible, but I loved it. We just barely scratched the surface of just how complex and amazing the soil is. There are a lot of stuff going on in the soil, microbial wise, and a lot of these things are really helping us out, whether they're mycorrhiza, fungi, predatory nematodes, rhizobium bacteria. There's a lot of good stuff in there, and the more organic material we can add to the soil, that's going to really help these guys out too and make the soil a lot more alive for us. Okay, remember I talked about soil analysis. So this is really important and really part of soil preparation. We want to make sure we get our soil tested, okay? I actually recommend doing this. If you're only going to do this once, I personally prefer, well, I'll talk about that later. But so whenever you look at a soil, if you're out in a field, you may just assume that, hey, the soil, is the same here as it is 100 yards away. Well, that's not true necessarily, especially if you get into a residential area where maybe someone had planted something in the past. Maybe there was a flower bed. Maybe they had put fertilizer here or there or whatever. So that's why it's important to get your soil tested, and that will identify what your soil has and what your soil needs, okay, instead of having to guess. All right, so I'm not going to talk too much about this because you are going to go more into detail about this, but you're going to do proper soil collection. So let's say this is your vegetable garden going in here, or your lawn. You want to make sure you go kind of in a grid, a random pattern, make sure you get plenty of soil samples, okay? We don't sample it just from one corner. We want a representative sample, and we want to go deep enough that it's going to represent the depth that those roots are actually growing into. So usually we say a foot is going to be sufficient for most trees. Some people like to go 18, 24 inches. Most of the roots, keep in mind that they're actually taking up water, nutrients are only going to be in the top foot, okay? For turf grass, some people will only go 6 inches down. What we do is after we get these soil samples, we go and we mix these different samples up into one composite sample. We send in, it only takes about a pint. You send that in and you indicate what kind of test you want done, and hopefully you get your results back in 2 to 4 weeks, okay? There are a lot of labs out there, and obviously you don't have to use the A&M one, but that's the one we're familiar with. And so here it is. This is what a soil sample submittal form is going to look like. And so a couple of things to keep in mind, okay? You're going to indicate what your sample is. You may, for example, have turf, you may have vegetables, whatever. So this allows you to keep up with what's what. They're going to ask you some questions. You don't always have to know how much fertilizer was put out previously, blah, blah, blah. This is really important though, okay? See this I am growing, see below, this letter? You want to make sure that you select from this group what best identifies what you're growing, okay? Because how you fertilize turf grass is very, very different from how you fertilize rose bushes or fruit trees or whatever else, okay? So whatever recommendations they give you are going to be based off of the crop you select. And if you don't know, just put whatever's closest to it, okay? Down here, there are many options you could choose from. Depending on how detailed, how advanced the analysis is, it could cost you more and more. Like, for example, if you want to know the soil texture and also the organic matter percentage, it's going to cost you a little more. We recommend at least initially getting the option 2 done, R plus option 2, which is the routine nutrients, pH, and then also your micronutrients, okay? All right, so what this is going to do, this is going to take the guesswork out of what you need to apply fertilizer-wise, okay? So whenever you get your results back, it's going to look kind of like this, okay? Some of you may be looking at this and going, oh my gosh, overload. I don't know what any of this stuff means. I'm just going to blank out. I'm going to call Jayla. I'm going to call Tim Hartman, and they can help me with this. And that's fine. We're here to help you. However, this is, if you break it down, it's actually pretty simple to look at, okay? Oops. So this is the option 2, like we talked about, our major nutrients and micronutrients, okay? So they put on here garden, which I assume they meant vegetables. This is a real life example of the soil survey results, okay? So here you've got pH, how acid, how alkaline the soil is, conductivity, basically how salty the soil is, and then you've got these other specific nutrients, okay? We just read this like a bar graph. See this critical level, CL? That's where you want to be. If you're below it, then you're going to need to add that nutrient. You're going to need to address it. Now, this is a little bit tricky here. Sodium is actually usually harmful to plants, so we want our sodium to be low. But if you look at this, if you read this like a bar graph, sodium excluded, what do you see that's below where we'd like it to be? The only one that's there that's low, that's deficient, is our nitrogen, nitrogen. And notice it's reporting at 0 parts per million. And in fact, it's telling you right here, they're recommending you add 1.4 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. Now, when you learn about soils and fertilizers, they'll walk you through how to act. Probably Dr. Maurer will walk you through how to actually take this information, this data here, and actually extrapolate it out and make that fertilizer application. But that's telling you right here, all we need is nitrogen, okay, which is typical of a lot of soils in Texas. So the take-home message here is we do not add triple 13. We do not add Osmocote 15-9-12, okay? You're only going to add a nitrogen source because that's all we need. If we add some of these other things like phosphorus that's already getting pretty high, we can end up with too much phosphorus, which is bad for the plant and bad for the environment, okay? So you can see how this is basically a prescription for your specific soil with respect to whatever you're trying to grow. Okay, so just a little example. For my master's, I worked on peach breeding, and I had about 400 different seedling selections of these. You could think of them as crossbred or hybrid peaches. Seedlings, had to graft them all, grow them. Some of them were nectarine, some of them were peaches, some were round, some were the donut peaches. A lot of fun stuff, a lot of data. I had the same trees, same types growing in California. I sent graftwood over there. These I grafted and took data on. This, folks, is some of the lousiest soil in Texas, okay? This is right across from the vet school here on campus. Terrible, terrible clay, very poor structure. We have a lot of sodium in our water, but you know what I did? I got a bunch, hundreds and hundreds of cubic yards of composted horse manure and wood shavings from the vet school and the horse centers. I rented a dump truck and spread it out. Tilled it in. I tilled in some gypsum too, which can also be beneficial. I'll let Dr. Maurer talk about that later. But I pulled a blade behind the tractor and made these terraces, essentially raised beds. I planted my peaches on top of here, and they grew like crazy, and they produced really well too, on a site that you couldn't even grow weeds on otherwise very well. Okay. So that's the difference that proper soil preparation will make for you. It really, really pays off in the end in terms of water, nutrient holding capacity, and just overall plant performance. Okay, appropriate plant selection, all right? So you see this picture? What do y'all think about this? Y'all think this is an attractive landscape? Okay, I gotta be careful here. I met someone who actually moved into this house after the previous owners had landscaped it. And we had a good time talking about it. But anyway, a lot of people assume that for a landscape to be drought tolerant, water efficient, this is what it has to look like. And that is not true. Even for y'all out there in El Paso, okay? Y'all, some of your plant palette may look a little more like this, and that's okay. But we don't have to go to this extreme, especially in our part of Texas here, okay? We want to choose plants that do well here, all right? So I thought this was funny. I got a good laugh out of this. This was out toward where I live on the west side of College Station. Somebody paid good money to get a Colorado blue spruce and put it in. Well, it wasn't blue for very long. It was brown about a month later, and then it was firewood, okay? So we want to make sure we choose plants that actually grow well, but also have good drought, heat, disease, and pest tolerance. Okay, so does this look a little better, okay? A little more better. These are plants that most of these are native. They have outstanding heat, drought, pest tolerance. They also look good, okay? So we'll talk about some ways we can choose these plants. All right, I'm gonna get away from the presentation real quick, and we're gonna walk through how to use the EarthKind plant selector, okay? So we're back to our EarthKind website, right? earthkind.tamu.edu. So you see this EarthKind plant selector. You can either choose here or here. So here's the EarthKind plant selector. Let me just go back to the other one. Making plant selections. This kind of gives you an idea, kind of a few instructions on how to choose your plants. So now I'm going to go to the EarthKind plant selector. Okay, and so this is what it's going to look like for you. So let's do North Texas, okay? So again, the reason why we have Texas broken down into 8 different regions is because you got very different temperatures here. Here you've got very different rainfall. We go from 50 plus to less than 8 inches. Usually we have more alkaline soil, more acid soil here as we go further east. And so Texas is very different. And so it's not necessarily true that one plant is gonna fit all, okay? So if we can choose based on our region, that's really gonna help us pinpoint plants that are gonna do well for us. So North Texas, okay? So let's see, we can either look for a plant by its common name. So let's say iris. I talked about iris. Oops, let me see if it's, okay, I know it's there, but let's talk about hibiscus. Okay, I got to check on this. For some reason. Okay, so I prefer to use scientific names, but anyway, you could use common or scientific names. So remember I was talking about that vine for a pergola, for an arbor called crossvine, Bignonia capreolata. Let's look under Bignonia, okay? There it is. See, we got this auto-complete thing. If you don't remember the whole scientific name or common name, there it is, okay? So I could go click on that and do search by above criteria. Bam, there it is. Notice only one hit. We've only got one plant there. And it's going to tell you how well it's going to do in your region, which in this example is North Texas, okay? But that's probably not how most of you are going to use this. Most of you are probably going to use this based on a type of plant you're looking for. So remember we talked about shade-tolerant ground covers, okay? So we've got this option here for growth habit. I'm going to look for a ground cover. And we've got a lot of different criteria we can select here, but I'm going to just look for exposure. So partial sun, yeah, partial sun is okay. Shade is good too. I don't want for sun. I just want to look for a ground cover for partial sun or shade. And we could get more specific, like bloom, color, leaf character, if it's deciduous, evergreen, herbaceous, perennial, but we're just going to stick with these, okay? All right, we're going to do search by above criteria. Don't do show all plants for region because that's totally just negates all the criteria you just selected, okay? Search by above criteria. Okay, and some of these are kind of, I disagree with some of their designation as ground cover, but here's some different ones. Here's that Turk's cap we talked about. I'm going to choose this one. Here's a cool one that a lot of you, most of you in the state can grow. It's called coralberry, Symphocarpus or bigulatus. It's actually in the Caprifoliaceae, the honeysuckle family. Okay, click on that. I've got some newer pictures that I took. I think I took these actually out by my house. This is a native plant. It's a native ground cover, kind of a sub-shrubby type plant. It spreads by rhizomes. It's deciduous. These little purple, they're really more of the pinkish purple berries. They're kind of pretty going in the wintertime. And it tells you everything you need to know about this plant, what you can use it for, the height. Notice width says indefinite, should be a comma there, from rhizomes, because it kind of spreads on its own. And so this is one that it's a little bit kind of rough looking. I wouldn't use it in a formal landscape, but can do really well as a ground cover in shady conditions. And if you shear it a little bit, it kind of cut it back every once in a while, that'll help too. Okay, so notice it has this EarthKind index of 10, okay? Now let me back up. You see how these results populate, and you'll notice this EarthKind index. Here, see the farthest column on the right, and see it starts out with 10, then it'll start going down to 9 and 8. We want to select plants that have a score of 8 or higher, okay? That tells us that they're generally going to be pretty well adapted to our region. Keep in mind that if I looked at this plant, say in El Paso, in the Trans-Pecos area, it would not get as high of a score because its drought tolerance is not going to really hold up there, okay? So let's see exactly how it got this perfect score in this case of 10. It has high heat tolerance. I agree with that. Low water use. So if we were putting this in if we were kind of trying to figure out where to do this with respect to hydrozoning, where to put it in the landscape, this would be our low water use group, or it can survive usually off of just natural rainfall. So that's where that comes in. Soil requirements, low soil requirements. That means it doesn't care if it's in an acid sandy soil in East Texas or if it's in an alkaline clay soil as you go further west. So that's nice. pest tolerance, and these terms need to be changed, but this is taken into account diseases and pests like insects and mites. It has high pest resistance. That means that generally it's not going to have any major problems with pests or diseases. Fertility requirements, and notice fertility is separate from soil. Soil, we're talking about the type of soil, whereas fertility, that's specifically how much fertilizer do we have to apply to keep this thing happy, to look its best. And in this case, it's low. It doesn't need a lot of extra nitrogen, for example. And then it'll also tell you, it says best in naturalized settings or in informal, like I said, landscapes, okay? Can function as a tall ground cover. We don't have any plants on here that we recommend that are actually designated as invasive. But if there is a plant, for example, some people really do not like Chinese pistache because it can spread by seed. That is not officially an invasive plant, but because it has that tendency to spread by seed, we will mention in here, you know, can prolifically reseed, blah, 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 kind of as a warning to people. But it's still a great landscape plant, and so we do include it on here. Okay, so that is the EarthKind plant selector. I hope it'll really help you a lot as you're learning about plants, not only specific plants, but also as you're searching for plants as you work on your landscape. Okay, so let me go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so again, check that out. By the way, there is an app for this. You have to go to the App Store. It's kind of hard to find, but there is an app that our former webmaster put together. There's one for Android and then a separate one for iPhone. You don't get it here. You have to search in the App Store for it. Okay, I don't think I left anything out, hopefully. Okay, so a little more about plant selection. I mentioned that we do a lot of plant trialing with the EarthKind program. There is also the Texas Superstar program. So if you get kind of confused between these two, the Texas Superstar program is just another program of AgriLife Extension and also AgriLife Research. And basically they test plants, see how well they do in 4 locations: Lubbock, San Antonio, College Station, and then Overton, which is near Tyler. They look at primarily ornamentals, but they have some specialty plants, like they do have some vegetables and fruit. And basically they are looking for plants that just provide outstanding, almost foolproof landscape value throughout a season, okay? And they're tested for multiple years, multiple locations, basically representing the whole state. And more recently, they've started to look at drought tolerance too. So most of these are going to have, we know they're going to have good heat tolerance, but they're usually going to have pretty good drought tolerance as well. And so this just provides another great set of plants that work well in the EarthKind landscape. Okay, so let's talk specifically about types of plants, okay? Obviously, we can't spend all day talking about plants. There are too many. There are too many different regions I'm speaking to today, but basically when we talk about plant selection, we use the terms native and adapted, okay? So native would be defined as a plant that originated here, at least since Christopher Columbus and the Columbian Exchange, all that stuff. So I put together this little collage of different examples of natives. We have a lot of beautiful native plants. I think that's why Texas is as pretty as it is. I think a lot of it's due to the plants. Being an ag, you had to throw in the maroon blue bonnets. So we have a lot of cool native plants, okay? Now, there are a lot of benefits to natives, and these include they're going to have, of course, natural tolerance to drought and heat. They're going to have pretty good tolerance and resistance to the pests and diseases because they originated here. But there are other benefits. They're going to provide natural wildlife habitat and food. They're going to support beneficial organisms. A lot of our, think about our pollinators. Think about many of our predatory insects in other stages of their life may also require pollen of some of our native plants. And so for that reason, I really, really encourage you to use, had a loud jet go through. I really encourage you to use natives in the landscape, okay? You don't have to be all native, but at least have a decent portion of your landscape that includes natives, okay? That's gonna help our pollinators. That's gonna help provide a habitat for beneficial insects that are really going to help us out a lot in the fight against pests. Okay, so really encourage you to do this. Now, and these are just some examples of different natives that do well kind of throughout the state. Cedar elm, bald cypress, which is really more the eastern and coastal part of the state. There are a lot of different types of cypress too. There's also the Montezuma or Mexican cypress, which is semi-deciduous. It's more spreading. It does not produce knees. It does better for you out in kind of central Texas area where you don't have a lot of humidity. This is Texas persimmon, Diospyros texana, which I grew up with. And the female plants actually produce these little black fruit that'll stain your teeth black, and they taste like a prune. I grew up eating them just, I don't know, because I was a kid. I would eat anything. But what's cool about this plant is it's pretty much indestructible. It has beautiful multi-trunk, kind of what I would call a living sculpture type trunk plant, exfoliating bark, and again, tough as nails. Possum holly can be grown over most of the state. This is our deciduous holly. And what happens is it loses its leaves, unlike most holly species, but it does so to show these beautiful red or orange berries that give us color throughout most of the dormant season. Mexican bush shades, great for butterflies and hummingbirds. Red yucca, I love this plant, very drought tolerant. Comes in actually red, pink, and yellow. This is Mexican feathergrass. We use a lot of ornamental grasses. They're becoming very popular in landscapes across the state because they're really tough and really easy to grow. Now, one thing about ornamental grasses is they generally need good drainage and they need a lot of sun too. The exception would be inland sea oats is pretty like shade. This is a cool one. Dr. Arnold here in our department who teaches the plant landscape materials class calls this the who hair grass because it kind of looks like the hair on Dr. Seuss's Who's. But anyway, good example of an ornamental grass. Here's one that I learned fairly recently, and I'd encourage you to look for. It's not very common, but it's called water clover, Marsilia macropoda. It's basically like a four-leaf clover type plant, although it's really more related to a fern than a clover, and it thrives in really wet, boggy type areas. It only gets about 4 inches tall or so. It likes full sun, and these four-leaf clover little leaves close up at night and also during full sun too, and it's really hot. And I found that even if it does get dry, even though it likes wet conditions, when it gets dry, it just kind of wilts on down, withers away, but it'll come back during when the season gets rainy again. So this would be a good candidate for a rain garden type area or other boggy type areas. I'm starting to see a few other nurseries carrying it. I know some of the native type nurseries in Austin will carry it, but it's a little bit hard to find still, and it is a native. Okay, I mentioned native plants, but we also have a lot of other plants that also do well and simply expand our available plant palette. Now, granted, these are not natives, okay? They did not originate here in Texas, but many of these, like the ones I'll talk about and that have a good EarthKind index score, are going to be just as well adapted, sometimes better adapted than the natives, okay? So we like to have a mix of natives and a mix of adapted, okay? Now, if you want to be all native, if you want to stick with strictly natives and be an all native landscape, no problem. I think that's great, no problem. But for many other people, this just allows us to kind of expand the available plants that we can choose from. And so being a kind of a fruit person, I've got a lot of fruits in here that also have ornamental value. Here's that Chinese pistache. Here in College Station, it's our best source of fall color, red color besides poison ivy. We don't have a lot of fall color here in College Station. Chinese fringe tree will grow through most of the state. There is an East native version of this, Chionanthus virginicus, that grows in East Texas. This one just happens to be a little more showy. There's that Chinese pistache again. This is the one that I'm working on doing research on. This is pineapple guava, Aca Soloiana. This is kind of the southern half, or really southern third of the state. You go up really north of Waco, even above really, even getting into DFW starts to get too cold for it many years. But this is a really nice evergreen shrub to small tree, and has beautiful, actually edible, showy flowers in late spring. And then it gives way to these fruit, which normally are going to be these tiny little things. But these are some that I saw in New Zealand when I was studying kiwi fruit over there. And some specific varieties of this plant can produce large, very tasty fruit. And there's a small commercial industry of this fruit in New Zealand. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to acquire some of these improved name selections, get them propagated. They almost always have to be grafted, and see how they do as an edible landscape kind of plant in Texas. And also I'm looking at their fruit quality specifically. And this is a very easy plant, has very few pest and disease problems. Here's another one, Oriental or Asian persimmon, Diospyros kaki. It's the Asian species of persimmon that's grafted onto usually our American persimmon. It's a very easy fruit to grow along with jujube, and also has some ornamental value to it. Rosemary, except for some of you up in the more northern part of the state, is generally going to be a perennial for most of us. You can also grow it as an annual, and I just love this plant, many different uses. So we talked about roses, okay, and this is just an example of the power of genetics, okay, and we're talking about traditional breeding here, just FYI. But tale of two roses, okay, so this is one of the miniature roses that was bred and developed in California, where it doesn't rain during the summertime, i.e. no disease pressure. It doesn't get black spot or anything like that. They don't have that problem out there, so they don't have to worry about it when they select new varieties. You move that thing to Texas, and especially here in College Station, and in a year or two, inevitably it died. Whereas this is Carefree Beauty or Katy Road Pink, which is one of the designated EarthKind roses, picture taken at the same time, and no visible disease. And by the way, this one, you can't see the disease because it's already defoliated. So again, we have there's a lot of potential with plant selection, even within a given type of plant. We do a lot of plant testing around the state. Here are some of the sites, even out of state, a lot of different types of plants. More recently, we've moved to herbs and grapes and vegetables. Here, this is at Myers Park, which is McKinney. These are the Collin County Master Gardeners, and led by Dr. Greg Church, and I'm trying to remember, the name escapes me. We have a new really good horticulturist there too. They've done really an outstanding job with EarthKind trials. So we've got roses, of course, crepe myrtle, vegetables, grapes, which Dr. Justin Shiner and then more recently Michael Cook have been kind of taking charge on, perennials, annuals. I just finished a couple of years ago a trial on culinary herbs, looking at different cultivars of oregano, sage, and rosemary. And again, all these trials are done where the plants are grown with just compost, mulch, and a little bit of drip irrigation, no other input. So the idea is, if a plant does really well under these conditions, if you take it and put it in someone's landscape where it's probably going to get some water, probably going to get bailed out, if you need to spray or fertilize every once in a while. We've been testing these plants under essentially the worst case scenario conditions. So we know that they're going to do well when someone puts them in their landscape. Okay. Moving on to rainwater harvesting and drip irrigation, we're going to start out with rainwater harvesting first. And I'm just going to talk briefly about it because I believe you have another section on water conservation, a whole other lecture. Okay. So kind of as a review to where we're at, where we've gotten to so far, we've talked about design, we've talked about where to put the plants, how to select the plants, how to improve the soil. Now we're going to talk about how to properly water them using as little water as possible, but also at the same time reducing problems with pests, disease, and weeds. So this is a rainwater capture system, and this is the one at the Brazos County Master Gardeners here in town, their demonstration garden. And basically a rainwater collection system consists of its catchment surface. So in this case, it's a roof. and that's where the water the rainwater falls. Then we have the conveyance, which usually is going to consist of a series of gutters, downspouts. We're going to use usually light gauge sewer type pipe, actually, because it's cheaper, it's gravity flow, you don't have to worry about pressure. And then we have the tank, the storage, which in my experience is the most expensive part. Now you can get these black poly tanks. Like I got one for, I think I paid about $1,300 for a 2,500 gallon tank. So usually you're going to pay about 50, 60, 70 cents per gallon. But they can cost quite a bit more if you go up to these like galvanized ones with vinyl bladders on the inside. It just depends on how much you want to spend. But essentially the benefits are we are collecting water out of the sky for free, okay? That's less water we're going to have to use from the meter, less potable water we're having to use. The other thing about this is essentially pure water, okay? Here in College Station, our sodium, our water is bad, okay? We can defoliate a tree literally in a month just from the sprinkler depositing the sodium on the leaves. I'll show you pictures of that, okay? So we can't grow things like gardenias, azaleas, orchids, blueberries just because of the water quality. But this allows us to be able to grow those kind of things because we've got good quality water. And this is the formula for figuring out how much water you can collect. It's the gallons harvested water equals square foot times the rainfall times, usually we use this constant of about 0.6, and we've already got our square feet. So here's the example. 1,500 square foot roof area can capture about 37,000 gallons. And this was based off of, I forgot who this was for, what example, but 41.7 inches, which is a little more than we get in College Station. 37,000 gallons. That's a lot of water. So usually you can catch a lot more water than you're able to store. Now, just FYI, most of the time, if you're going to try to use this in the landscape for irrigation, even drip irrigation, you're usually going to have some type of pump to get a little more pressure. The pressure just from gravity is usually not going to be sufficient. Okay, along the same line of thinking, we can also plant plants that need a little more water in places like here. This is at my parents' house in Blanco, where the AC condensate comes out. So the water drips out. Here in College Station, we have a lot of condensate because it's so humid. This is essentially distilled water, although you don't want to drink it. And this is Clematis texensis, scarlet leatherflower. Beautiful native Texas clematis or clematis. And this particular plant needs quite a bit of water. You usually find it near stream beds in Central Texas. Well, it just thrives where this AC condensate comes out, where it's always got a little bit of water coming out. So just another kind of thinking outside the box idea for you. All right, let's talk about irrigation. Okay, it's been estimated that somewhere around 90% of the irrigation in Texas is spray or sprinkler irrigation. Okay, so what we are doing essentially is we are throwing water up into the air to a certain height, and these drops are going to come down and hopefully go where they're supposed to, hopefully soak into the soil so the plants can get them. But it doesn't always work that way, obviously, okay? 3 major types we're using, spray heads, which are these smaller type heads. They're used for smaller applications. We see people using these for flower beds, for landscape beds, but we want to get away from using these for our ground covers, our shrubs, and our perennials. We should be using drip irrigation there. We only want to use spray irrigation for turf only, okay? These guys are usually going to put out about 2 inches of water per hour generally. Then we have rotors, okay? So these are water hydraulic driven rotors that are actually going to turn. Some of these are the ones that make the sound like we always think of. Some of these don't. Some of these just continue to turn. And so what we have basically is these are adjustable, but you've got this stream and it's being partially blocked. So we've got water that's falling down all the way from the sprinkler itself, the head itself, to out to the very end of it, okay? These guys are usually putting out about 1 to 2 inches of water per hour. But again, the problem with these things is, well, we'll talk about the problems in a little bit. The water doesn't always go where we want it to go. It's one of the major problems. And of course, there are also hose-in sprinklers as well. You might use like for small areas in your lawn at home or something like that. Okay, so here are some of the inherent problems with sprinkler or spray irrigation, okay? Evaporation, okay? And this is why we always say water at early in the morning or at night. Don't water during the middle of the day, because what happens, we're throwing these drops up there. Those drops evaporate. We lose a lot of that water. Sometimes 50% evaporates before the drops ever hit the ground, okay? Runoff is a big problem. Remember I told you that these things put out 1 to 2 inches of water per hour? Well, many of our soils, especially a clay or compacted turf soil, are not going to absorb. They're not going to allow that much water to soak in that quickly. It's like it's raining too fast, essentially. We're going to have a lot of runoff, which goes off into the storm drain. And essentially, this is our drinking water that's getting wasted, okay? So that's the other big problem. And then also, we have a lot of this water that goes off target. It shoots out too far. Maybe the sprinkler is misaligned. Maybe it's been bent over, something like that, or even worse, we could have a pop-up like I showed you that's broken off, and we've just got a geyser there, basically, okay? So there have been improvements in technology. This is a rotator or multi-stream rotor, and basically what it does is it keeps the water, the spray at a lower trajectory. They're larger drops. They're generally more efficient. We're starting to see more of these used, but we've still got water that's being evaporated, and the water is usually put out faster than the soil can absorb it. Okay, in comparison, let's look at drip irrigation, also commonly referred to as micro irrigation. Basically, the water is being put out slowly, a little bit at a time, and being put out at ground level or even below ground, okay? So we're looking, instead of about 50 to 70% efficiency with sprinkler irrigation, we're seeing up to 90% efficiency with our drip or micro irrigation. And there are a couple main reasons for that. As you see here, this is an example of inline drip tubing. So this is just plastic tubing, and every foot or 2 feet or so, depending on the product, you have a little emitter built in. And this emitter, what it'll do is it slowly doles out the water, usually at a rate of 1/2 gallon to 1 gallon per hour, okay? That's not a lot of water. That's very slow. And for that reason, we have to run this thing usually for hours as opposed to minutes, like we would with sprinklers, okay? The other thing, if you look right there, you notice that this drip tubing, the water is coming out right there at the surface, okay? So if the water's coming out right there on top of the ground, on top of the mulch, there's really no way for it to, or very little of it's going to evaporate away. We're not throwing it up into the air, and it's coming out slowly, so we should have very little runoff, okay? So because of that, it's much, much more efficient. A lot of different products out there. I'll show you some examples in a little bit, but we get some other benefits from drip irrigation, not just the water savings. Okay, most of y'all probably recognize this. So some of the major diseases on roses are downy mildew, black spot, cercospora. Downy mildew and black spot both require, these are fungal pathogens, okay? And what you have are these spores on the leaves. The spores will not start growing and infect the leaf unless there's water on the leaves for several hours, okay? That's why you see a lot of disease in places where it rains a lot, okay? So if you think about it, if you're trying to prevent disease, why would you repeatedly wet the leaves of your plants and expose them to disease on purpose? So if we keep the water off the leaves, we're going to have a lot less disease problems. Another issue is, this is an example of drip irrigation that's been running for several hours. The water has been running, but notice most of that soil is dry, okay? What's actually happening is where the water is released at these little emitters, the water comes out, and as it goes down through the soil, it spreads out. Okay, the water through wicking, it kind of spreads out. And we're getting, even though it doesn't look like it here, you go a few inches down and we've got the soil wetted, but we're not wetting the surface. If you think about it, if you have ever ever worked on a farm or something, when you really see the most weeds is right after rain, okay? But that's because those weed seeds are right there on the surface, and when that surface gets wetted by the rain, that's when they all come up. So if we're not wetting all that surface, we have a lot less disease problems too. Another benefit is for those of you, as you get more into North and West Texas, you start to have issues with water quality, chlorides, boron, especially sodium. Here in College Station, we have, it's like, well, it's not like seawater, but it almost seems like it. We have so much sodium in the water here that after repeated wetting of the leaves, we continue to throw water on those leaves and wet them. The water evaporates and leaves behind the sodium that deposits, and it just burns up the leaves basically. And so if you have a lot of salt or a lot of sodium or chloride in your water, it'll really help also to use drip irrigation, because usually the roots can tolerate that sodium a lot better than the leaves can. Here's an example. This is, I'm not making this up. This is right behind our building, and you can literally see where the rotor sprinkler, actually the pattern, you can see where it wets the canopy of this Chinese pistache, and every year that poor thing puts out new leaves, and a month later it gets defoliated after the water gets on it, whereas this is still alive up here. So again, drip irrigation, if we use it, we wouldn't have this problem. A lot of different products out there. Here's some examples. So typically we're going to be working with some type of inline drip tubing, okay? Some of you probably remember that when the first drip irrigation came out, you would buy the tubing, the plastic tubing, and then you would get these little, you get the hole punch, and then you punch in the little button looking thing, that's where the water comes out, the emitter. You can still buy material like that, but now what we tend to use more is this inline drip tubing. So like I said, every foot, every 18 inches, every 2 feet, we have an emitter that is built in, it's internal. And what it actually does is it doles out the water at the same spacing, the same amount, and it's also even because it's pressure compensated. So this is a lot easier. Now it's more expensive to do it this way, but of course, another example would be, or similar would be a soaker hose. You can buy the rubber type ones. I prefer the fabric type ones. They seem to hold up a lot better. They can also work. I like the drip tubing better personally. We can also get little adjustable drippers. I really like these for starting trees, getting them started, because you can adjust them from about 1 gallon per hour to 10 gallons per hour and kind of spread out that water. In orchard situations, we use a lot of times these micro sprays or micro sprinklers. And yes, they're technically sprinklers, but they're low volume, so it's not going to be much runoff. And we also keep the water down very low, so there's little issues with evaporation loss. We're also starting to see people using more and more subsurface drip irrigation. And so this is used for turf grass most of the time. And so what they'll do is they'll actually have this inline drip tubing actually underneath the turf. So usually they'll do it before they put the turf in. They'll have it several inches down. And so yes, you're actually watering the turf with drip irrigation, but it's below ground, obviously out of the way of mowers and stuff like that. And so that's really cool. They're working out the kinks with this technology. It's really improved. It's starting to be a lot more common. The last thing I want to mention about drip irrigation is to the gentleman who had asked earlier in the break about converting from sprinkler to drip. Yes, you can absolutely do that. And here's an example of that. So this particular product is available at like a Ewing or an irrigation supplier, but I'm starting to see more and more technology like this at the Lowe's, Home Depots, places like that. And this is what we call a retro kit, okay? So essentially what this is going to do is you unscrew your pop-up sprinkler head, okay? So let's say you want to put in and this part of your lawn you want to put in a flower bed. So you find those sprinkler heads, those pop-up sprinklers, replace them with these guys. This has a built-in filter, a built-in pressure regulator, because drip irrigation usually won't. It needs to be 40, 45 PSI, if not lower. It needs lower pressure. And then you can put on an adapter that goes to this inline drip tubing. Okay, here's the caveat though. You can only do this for one whole zone or station at a time. And remember, a zone or a station, basically that's a region. That's a part of the landscape that you're watering. So if you look at if you open up your irrigation controller and you see, station or zone 1 through 8, that's the region that you're watering at one given time with that sprinkler. Then it'll go to another station or another zone. Okay, what you cannot usually do, you cannot usually have a zone that is half sprinkler and half drip. And the reason is because, remember, drip irrigation, you're going to have to water it a lot longer because the water's coming out slowly. Usually you're looking at, at least 2 or 3 hours that you'll have to run it. Whereas sprinklers, you may only be running them for 20 minutes. Okay, so they don't jive together that way. So you have to do a whole station or a whole zone at a time. But yes, you can certainly do that. What that does is it frees you up from having to go in and put all new pipe in and solenoid wires and sprinkler wires and all that, as you see in this case, which of course is expensive, and it's probably going to kill your trees too if you cut all the roots up like that. So again, this is called a retro kit. Okay, just talking about being more efficient with our water, a couple of things we can do additionally are cycle and soak irrigation. So we had a question earlier about how much water, or I think the question was, how long do we water our turf? Do we water it for once a week or twice a week? And I said usually we want to try to put out 1 inch, a whole inch at a time. Now keep in mind, most soils you're not going to be able to put a whole inch of water out at once because a lot of it's going to run off, especially in a clay soil. So what you can do is you can do something called cycle and soak irrigation, or multi-cycling. You can Google Texas A&M Water University. They do a lot of good stuff on water conservation. They have a really good publication on this. Again, it's cycle and soak is the term. But what we're doing is we're basically breaking up these different watering events. Okay, so if we know we have to water 20 minutes to get 1 inch in a given station, a given part of our lawn, instead of watering, let's say 30 minutes, instead of watering 30 minutes all at once, what we're going to do is we're going to split that up into 3 different events, 10 minutes each. Okay, so we're still putting out 30 minutes collectively, but only 10 minutes at a time. Okay, and the way we can do that is with our different programs. Most irrigation controllers are going to have 3 or 4 programs, usually A, B, C, D, and then they're going to have multiple stations. Usually your stations or your zones are going to be different numbers. The program, that's basically your you can think of your program as basically like the order that you're going to run your different zones. Your zones or stations, again, those are the regions, the independent places in your landscape that you're watering one at a time. Okay. All right. So when you do this, for most controllers, you can only you have to run all the zones through one station before the next station will go. Okay. So let's say you've got 4 zones and you've got 3 stations. Okay. You have to run all 4 stations before the next program can kick in. So what we can do is we can program this to where we run 10 minutes on our turf here, 10 minutes on this other station of turf, 10 minutes on another station of turf, and then maybe we go to our vegetables, water them for a little bit, and then we're done. Okay. Then the next program kicks on and we just repeat it. And so what we're doing is we're splitting these 10-minute run times up by about an hour or 2, and that just allows that soil to soak up the water. And again, this publication will kind of outline this, describe this a little more in detail. A couple things to keep in mind. Remember, we want to try to water an inch at a time, even if we have to split this up. by a couple hours or so. Another thing is keep in mind, and this is a big one. I see this many times where someone will they'll plant something like a mesquite tree, or there was one grower I worked with, and he planted jujube trees. Jujube is a very drought tolerant, easy to grow fruit tree. And he planted these things in May. And I went back and looked later, and I said, what happened to your jujube trees, and where's the irrigation? And he said, well, I thought they're drought tolerant. I didn't think they needed water. Well, any kind of plant is going to need water. It's going to need to be babied until it gets established. For a tree, that may take a couple years. If it's a tomato transplant or a bedding plant, it may only take a couple weeks. But so just keep that in mind too, that you're going to have to baby and really water heavily and frequently until those plants get established. And that is, those roots really grow out into the surrounding soil. There are a lot of different ways you can determine when to water. Really, the screwdriver test is probably one of the easiest, or you can just dig away the soil and just look and see how far down do you have to go before the soil gets dry. The soil may be dry on the very top, and you may think, oh, it's dry, it's crusted over, I need water, but it may be really wet just an inch down. So make sure you check that, and that'll help you determine when to water. A few other things to keep in mind is slab watering. Slab watering is something you can do, especially if you're on a heavy clay soil, blackland, prairie type area. You can keep the soil around your slab. You want to keep it moist. If it dries out a lot, then you get a lot of crack. You can have cracking of your slab, which is very expensive to have repaired. Tree watering. Tree watering is something that's really important, and it has to be done correctly. Skip Richter, who is actually the county horticulturist here in Bryan College Station, did a great video on Facebook about tree and shrub watering. And whenever a tree is established, that is once it's been in there for several years where the roots have grown out, the roots are going to be out in this outer area. Okay. A lot of people think that you water right here at the trunk. I see a lot of people doing the thumb watering, where they just water right there at the trunk, and that's not really going to help the tree at all. So the drip line is, if you were to look at a tree and you see the branches and you see how far out those branches extend. So right here, the tips of these branches, if you looked at noon and the sun was directly overhead, you see where that shadow is, where it casts that shade, or if you just draw a line straight down, that is your drip line, is out here on the edge of that shadow or the edge of your canopy. And it just so happens that's where almost all of the roots, the new young roots that are taking up water, are going to be out in this area. Now they'll be out, a little closer to the tree, and oftentimes they'll go out beyond that drip line. But research has shown that if you water right around the drip line, that's going to be the most effective place to get water to the tree where it can actually use it. And so remember, we said that most trees, once they're established, they can survive on natural rainfall. Those are the trees that are adapted. So usually we're only going to have to water these a couple times during the summer. And so what I like to do personally, I'll get a hose, I'll place it underneath the drip line at a certain point. I'll open the faucet to where water is coming out kind of slowly, maybe a quarter, half turn, and I'll let it just sit there and soak for hours, usually 2 or 3 hours, to where it really wets deep down. And then I'll go and move that over and just keep on moving around until I complete the circle. Of course, you could also use inline drip tubing. You could use soaker hose, but this is where we want to water and how we want to water our big trees. Okay. And again, we should only on established trees have to do this when it's really dry and give them a really good soaking. Okay. Last thing about irrigation. So somebody had asked about how to figure out, or how do you know how much water you're putting out? Well, the easiest way to do this is what's called a catch test. Okay. So basically what you can do is you can buy these from the AgriLife bookstore. You'll hear more about that as you go through this training later classes. But the AgriLife bookstore, we have a lot of different publications available, but you can also buy these little oops, these little Aggie catch cans. What these are, they're basically little fancy rain gauges. They come with a convenient little stand. They come in a pack of 5 for like $18 last I checked. And what you'll do is if this is one station or one region, one part of the lawn that you're watering at any given time, you'll set several of these out. I'll do at least 5, if not 10, kind of randomly out or in a grid pattern. You'll set them out, put them level, and what you'll do is you'll go back to your controller and you'll set this zone, this station to run for a predetermined amount of time. Usually 15 minutes is pretty good, pretty appropriate. Now, if you don't want to spend money on these catch cans, you can use anything that will collect water that has a straight edge on it. That is not tapered, straight up and down sides. Something like people use tuna cans all the time. Anything that's going to catch precipitation, okay? So what you do is you run this thing for a certain amount of time, let's say 15 minutes, this one station or zone, and then you go and you measure how much water is in there. If you've got half an inch of water, it's half an inch high, the water in there, well, there's a formula for it, but of course you can kind of do in your head the math, and you know that you're putting out 2 inches of water per hour, because if you do 4 times, multiply it times 4 to get your hour, that would give you 2 inches, okay? So that's your precipitation rate. So remember, we want to put out 1 inch per hour, 1 inch every time we water. So that tells you you only need to run that sprinkler system for 30 minutes, not an hour, not 2 hours, okay? The other thing you're going to look for is you're going to look for differences in precipitation, okay? If you've got this one can here that's showing, instead of half an inch, that's showing 1/10 of an inch, and then you got one over here that's showing a whole inch, that tells you something's off. That tells you that you're not getting uniform distribution of this water. And that means you're probably going to have to look at replacing heads or adjusting sprinkler heads, things like that. Now on the drip irrigation side, we can have drip tubing that ends up getting chewed up. Rodents and rabbits love chewing. For some reason, they seem to like the brown stuff more than the black stuff. One way to help prevent this is I actually put mulch, have my drip tubing underneath the mulch. It seems to help a little bit. Sometimes these guys will clog up. Sometimes you'll have other issues. But in any case, what you want to do for both drip and a spray or sprinkler irrigation system in your landscape is go through every once in a while and just run the thing. There's usually, you can run it on a manual function. You can set a zone to run 10 minutes or an hour and just walk around and see what's going on. You can identify problems and fix them right away. If you're only going to do this once a year, the best time is late winter, early spring, after your system's been sitting idle for a long time, subjected to potential freeze damage, and before you start watering for the upcoming season. So that would be an irrigation evaluation. You can also get a licensed irrigator to come in and perform this test as a professional. And if he or she does it as a licensed person, it's called an audit. All right, really quickly, we're going to talk about mulch, and we are going to get out of here early still, I promise, okay? All right, so remember, we already talked a little bit about mulch, remember I said 3 inches. We want to add and maintain a 3-inch layer of mulch, which is going to serve to continue replenishing the nutrients and organic matter into that soil. So we're going to talk a little more in detail about mulch and the benefits. So conservatively, mulch can reduce evaporation loss by 25 to 30%, which may not sound like that much, but that makes a big difference. Soil temperature modification. Soil gets hot in Texas, okay? That the sun really, as it heats up at top of the soil, it continues to heat. That heat goes further and further down. And remember, we've got our roots down there. Most of our roots are going to be in the top 8 to 12 inches, even on something like a tree. And so the hotter the roots get, the more stressed the tree is, the more our plant is, the more difficult it's going to be on that plant. And so if we can keep that soil temperature more modified, especially cooler in the summertime, which is when it's really important, that's going to help a lot. And we have seen differences of 30 to 50 degrees between bare soil without mulch and soil that's underneath mulch, okay? So it really, really helps to insulate that soil too, and keep it cooler and even a little warmer in the wintertime potentially. Okay, we know that mulch is very effective at controlling and preventing weeds. Obviously, that's one of the main reasons it's used. And again, that 3-inch layer is really going to help with that. If you get thinner, like an inch, it's not going to be quite as helpful. Erosion and runoff, it's going to help hold the soil in place. I'm always amazed when after I put mulch around a tree or something that I'm watering with a hose, just how long that mulch will hold the water there. It keeps the water from running off, running somewhere else. It locks that water there and allows it to actually go down into the soil and reduces the runoff. And the big thing, like I said, it's really continuing to feed that soil just like we have in a forest situation. Okay, but you got to do it right. We see many wrong ways that mulch is done, and anyway. Okay, so remember I said 3 inches. Some people use 4 inches. It kind of depends on what you're growing, the type of the mulch, the type of soil, but generally 3 inches is ideal. Okay, on trees it is possible to overdo the mulch on trees. Okay, so many research studies have actually shown that 2 to 3 inches, don't ever go over 3 inches on trees is ideal, at least in a landscape situation. But usually around 3 inches is what we're looking for. Okay, number one, you have to put the mulch out in sufficient quantity and coverage that it is actually effective. Okay, these are some crepe myrtles that are 15, 20 feet tall, mature already. And whoever did this, they put probably 1 cubic foot, about half of a bag around them. That's not going to do any good. And remember, the roots that are taking up the water are out here closer to the drip line. You're doing nothing for improving the soil or helping conserve water. It's really pointless doing that small of an amount. Mulch volcanoes, no, just don't do it. Don't think about it. And I mean, we see professional landscapers doing it all the time, or landscaping firms doing it all the time, but it doesn't mean it's correct. Okay. Remember, where the water nutrients are being taken up is right out here on the peripheral part of the root zone, okay, out toward the drip line. So if you put it here all bunched up, piled up against the base of the trunk, number one, it's not doing the tree any good. And number two, what it is doing is it can actually hurt its health, the health of the tree. So as this mulch breaks down, as it decomposes, what's going to happen, you're going to keep the base of this tree, which really needs to stay exposed to air so it can kind of dry out and everything. It needs to be able to breathe. It's staying wet under here. It's very moist. It's a great habitat for things like termites, for rodents. It can also help increase root rot organisms, things like Phytophthora root rot, which is a really nasty fungus. And so we really don't want to do this. So proper mulch is done 2 to 3 inches on a tree, and we want to go out ideally as far toward the drip line as possible. If you can go toward the drip line, that's the best thing you can do for the tree. Now, I realize in a lot of situations, if you've got a lawn too, you're probably not going to want to put that much mulch out, but the bigger the area, the better. Okay. Now, what I will do actually personally is I'd go and pull a little bit of mulch, pull a little bit of mulch away from that trunk. So there's actually a little ring around that trunk of just bare soil. So again, we want that root shoot interface to be able to breathe. So here are some issues that I've seen with where mulch was placed too high. We had some rot. This was a red oak, and some foot rot had occurred. And you go to the International Society for Arborists, their site, isa.org. They will always tell you, do not put mulch against the base of the tree. Here's another situation where there were actually mulch was removed later. And what happened was, by having that mulch there and keeping it moist right there around the base of the tree, roots started to grow. There are roots that developed opportunistically because it was moisture there. And we got this root circling, which can ultimately, if it's left if it's left unchecked, can end up strangling this tree as well. Okay. Oh, speaking of mulch, really quickly, just talking about different types of mulch, because I know there are always lots of questions on this. What we recommend generally is hardwood mulch, okay? Not that it's necessarily better than anything else, but because it's most commonly available. That's usually what you're going to get from a landfill as a recycled product, and it's usually going to be the cheapest too. Lots of other different types of mulches that are really good too. You could get, I like pine bark mulch. I use that a lot for my kiwi fruit. I love pine needle or pine straw mulch. I love how it locks together, how it allows for good infiltration of water. It helps to acidify the soil, but it's not cheap either, especially if you're far from East Texas. Pecan, people use pecan hulls, grass clippings, hay, all of these things. Wood shavings can work, but you got to be kind of careful with some of these, like hay, for example. Hay, depending on where it was grown, if that hay was treated with herbicides like picloram or grazon, these are herbicides that actually kill the broadleaf weeds in usually coastal or other types of improved Bermuda hay fields. And what happens, that herbicide doesn't go away. It actually gets absorbed into the plant. The hay gets baled, and even after the hay oftentimes is fed to cows and other livestock, that herbicide actually, residual amounts actually make it through the digestive tract of the animal and even into the poo, and even make it through the composting process. So you got to be really careful with hay. Find out where it was made. Make sure it wasn't treated with some of these herbicides. What else was I going to say? Oh, you can use rock, gravel mulch. You can use landscape type fabrics, but keep in mind, while they may prevent weeds and they may help a little bit with retaining water, they're not going to give you that benefit of releasing organic matter and nutrients because they're not carbon-based. They're not derived from once living materials. So we really recommend an organic carbon-based mulch. Okay. Georgina, if you can hold your question, and we just got a few more slides, and we'll take all the questions at the end. All right, lastly, I want to talk about appropriate maintenance. And so remember, as we talked about, and hopefully you've realized through this class, that if you're selecting the right plants, if you're preparing the soil properly, if you're putting them in the right place and maintaining them correctly, you're not going to have nearly as much maintenance to have to do. However, there are a few things that still have to be done, and we're just going to kind of highlight a few of them. I don't have to give you another reason to pull the weeds, to control the weeds, but one big thing, one issue with weeds is they are water hogs, okay? Weeds are weeds because they're successful. They're successful because they're actually drought tolerant. So weeds can survive with very little water. However, given the opportunity, if they're in a situation like an irrigated landscape or field where they do have lots of water, they will transpire. Remember, I think Jayla Bodney lecture talked about transpiring. They will wick away. They'll evaporate out water. They'll waste water essentially like there's no tomorrow. Okay, if there's plenty of water there. So they're water guzzlers, they're water hogs. So another big reason to get rid of them. We talked about making sure our waste, our clippings and leaves and all that gets recycled. You can do it at home, or you can make sure that you take advantage of some of these municipal or county recycling services. Pruning and grooming plants, okay? So pruning is not just about aesthetics, but pruning, making sure that we have the right form, removing, sometimes opening up the canopy on some trees is going to help reduce pest and disease problems. Sometimes if we do see a disease outbreak or let's say an aphid outbreak, they may be kind of clustered on a certain part of the plant. Sometimes it can be effective just to cut that portion off, remove it, especially if it's serving as disease inoculum, something that can infect the rest of the plant or other plants, and just dispose of it, just get rid of it. So we're getting rid of that source of biological source for reinfestation or infection. Irrigation troubleshooting, like I said, whether you do that yourself or you hire a professional and have it done in the form of an audit. Fertilizing based on soil testing. Remember, we talked about lawns, leaving our lawn clippings, mulching them, leaving them. as they're going to add and resupply nutrients, especially nitrogen and organic matter back to the soil, maintaining a reasonably tall blade length, and then integrated pest management. You're going to have a lecture that will talk all about pest management, but I just want to talk about it really briefly as it relates to the landscape. So integrated pest management, abbreviated as IPM, is basically a comprehensive, common sense, step-by-step approach to pest and disease control. So essentially, we're not going out with our biggest guns first and just blowing everything away. We're looking at it step by step. We're analyzing the situation, evaluating it, and we're going to go essentially with our least environmentally damaging measures first, and then gradually work our way up if we have to go use something a little more stringent. Okay, so these are what we call, as I define them, 4 pillars of IPM. The first one is cultural. Okay, so basically cultural implies that we're keeping the plants as healthy, as happy as possible, and also maintaining the landscape where it's going to be less conducive to our pests or our disease. Okay, so we're strengthening our plants and we're trying to keep down our pests or disease, and we do this through the way we manage the landscape. So an example would be on the cultural side, plant selection. So use cultivars, use species that have resistance or tolerance to those pests or diseases. Put them in a place where their phone is ringing off the hook today. Put them in a place where they're going to be less prone to disease or pests. Spacing, like I talked about with roses, make sure that they have adequate space where you put them somewhere where they get plenty of sun, they get air movement to dry that foliage off, where we have less disease outbreak. Careful fertility management. So studies have shown that, especially in the case of aphids, if you over-fertilize, if you especially use too much nitrogen on a plant, it produces all this really lush growth, and it's a lot more prone to attacks by aphids, and also some diseases like fire blight in the case of pears and other pome type plants. Okay, mechanical and physical. All right, so this is basically physically removing the pest, the disease, or the part of the plant that is attacked by the pests or the disease. So an example that I always use is spider mites. I'm not looking forward to, after this, I'm going to have to go in the greenhouse, suit up, and spray spider mites for a kiwi experiment I'm doing on boron toxicity. It's a soil science experiment. And spider mites are really bad in the greenhouse, and that's an example of cultural issues. Kiwi fruit almost never gets spider mites, but the second you move them into a greenhouse, they just get completely overwhelmed with spider mites, okay? Because you're putting them in a different environment, and you're also removing them usually from the natural predators, like the predatory mites that would normally control those pests. But spider mites can usually be controlled, at least in the landscape situation, by taking something like, I like to use these little pistol things like you use for, I don't know what you call them, but use them for washing your car or whatever, and it's got the squeeze handle, and they've got the different nozzle settings. And I like to use kind of like the flat or the fan setting, which sprays out like this, full blasts, high pressure, and I literally just wash the undersides of those leaves, which is where the mites tend to usually feed on, just literally wash them off. And this also works pretty well for aphids. And typically you do a good job of that, usually once or twice during the summer. That'll be sufficient to control them on things like brugmansia or some of the palms that can readily be attacked by them. Let's see. Okay, another thing that we have that's kind of going on all the time, kind of like our cultural control, is biological control. Okay, so biological control is basically operating under the assumption, the premise that your the enemies of your enemies are your friends. So you think about it out there in the landscape, in nature, you have lots of good guys, essentially. They may be other insects, they may be spiders, they may be even reptiles, birds that are helping control the pest populations out there and keeping them low. We don't realize how important these beneficial organisms are until they're removed, like I mentioned with moving these kiwi into the greenhouse. And so making sure that we're doing everything we can to preserve those natural enemies of our pest problems is really going to help us out a lot in the fight against pests and diseases. So this includes things like having a diverse plant palette, not having one species in there. Often we want to have natives in there because most of our beneficial agents are going to be on native plants, or they require native plants for habitat or different parts of their life cycle. And so if nothing else, if for no other reason, make sure you have native plants in your landscape just for that reason, to help promote beneficial insects and other beneficial organisms. The other big thing is try to avoid using broad spectrum insecticides. What is a broad spectrum insecticide? That is essentially a chemical agent. It's a pesticide that pretty much indiscriminately kills everything, okay? It is not selective. It doesn't just kill the bad guys. It's killing your good guys too. So things like most of our organophosphates, certainly neonicotinoids are like that, like imidacloprid, dinutefuran. So if we can, if ever possible, we want to choose a product that is going to target only our specific pests and do as little collateral damage as possible. So here's an example of that. So this is just a trade name, but this is an example, and this is the last slide, by the way. This is a product called Conserve, okay? This is the label that you would read. Hopefully you really should, by law, read this label before you make a pesticide application, or really even before you buy this pesticide, okay? And so it tells you the active ingredient, the percentage, tells you what you should be wearing, what you have to wear to make this application. For directions for use, you're always going to have this statement which says that if you use this product incorrectly, you're in violation of federal law, okay? And that's for your health and the health of the environment and even your plants, okay? So make sure technically the crop or your plant needs to be on there. The pest that you intend to treat needs to be on there. Okay, well, let me back up really quickly. How do we know which pesticide to use and what rate if we don't know what pest we're dealing with? And that's why Integrated Pest Management, or IPM, relies heavily on what we call scouting. Okay, scouting is going out there. You know, if you could do it once a week, at least, that would be ideal. Hopefully you're out there anyway because you love your garden and your landscape. But go out there and vigilantly inspect for disease and pest problems. That way you can identify them and if need to, treat them before they get to really be out of hand, okay? And so I'm talking about know the difference between spider mites versus scale versus aphids, okay? Just basic types of pests. You'll hopefully learn how to do that later on with your other training, okay? So once you know what you're treating for, then you know what pesticide to buy if you even need to, and then what rate to use. Now it may be that you only have 2 aphids on your rose bush, and you have to make that decision. Is it really bad enough? Is there really enough of a problem to warrant doing anything at all? Do I need to wash them off, or do I actually need to go get a pesticide? And if so, try to use a product like this. This particular one is an organic, naturally derived, or it's derived from actually a bacteria, and its efficacy is mostly just has efficacy mostly just against thrips and caterpillars and also fire ants. And it's not going to hurt some of your other things like your praying mantis, your lady bird beetles and things like that, okay? The bottom line is think of it step by step. Just don't go out with your biggest guns a-blazing first, and make sure you read your label. These are some more information. You'll have these slides available to you later as a PDF. Some of the other links I've mentioned. Here's my contact info, my email address, and my office number. Feel free to reach out. Hopefully this has been a good kind of preview to other things you're going to learn too. Again, thank you very much for your attention. I wish you the best of luck with the rest of your training and look forward to working with you in the future. that's it for the actual training. So at this point, I'll be happy to take any questions. If Jayla, if you don't mind unmuting everybody.
Everyone has to unmute themselves, I think.
Yeah.
So, yes.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I have, my roses are badly affected by thrips. I took it to a nursery and they showed it to me under the microscope.
Mm-hmm.
At first I tried insecticide and soap and neem. It didn't do anything. And he suggested, I think, something called acephate. I used it once or twice, but the smell is so strong, I just didn't want to use it. So is this conserve seed that you mentioned, is that effective against thrips? It seems to be pretty resistant and it has spread to all my knockouts, which I've had for 20 years without a problem. Wow. And it's well spaced, done everything that is good for roses, but still it's happened.
So acephate is the active ingredient of the insecticide sold under the trade name EarthKind. It's a organophosphate, and it does stink. It works really well against ants. I've used it before. It's been a long time, but it's a powder, and it works well, but it is some nasty stuff. The issue, and I'm sure it works on thrips, but yes, it's going to be definitely broad spectrum. It's going to kill a lot of the beneficials out there. It's also probably not the safest insecticide for you to use. I would probably be inclined, if you were going to use an actual pesticide, like a true chemical, conventional synthetic type one, I would probably use something with the active ingredient bifenthrin. That's spelled B-I-F-E-N-T-H-R-I, bifenthrin. And that's the active ingredient. Now, that's not the trade name. You'll have to look through and find something that is. But that is bifenthrin, which is a synthetic version of synthetic form of a pyrethrin, originally derived from the pyrethrum daisy. But this particular one formulation has pretty long residual. It lasts for a long time. But the good thing about pyrethrins is even though they are broad spectrum, they have very low mammalian toxicity. That's why what's frequently used for indoor pesticide applications, because they're, I'm not going to say harmless, but they don't do a lot of, they're not very toxic to humans and other mammals. The other thing about the other issue with thrips is they're not that difficult to kill, but the problem with thrips is they fly, they kind of fly in the breeze and everything. And so you trying to treat them on a few plants is almost like trying, I hate to use this analogy, but almost like scooping water out of a swimming pool, like one cup at a time. They just come right back in. And so you're going to have to treat frequently. Really, it's the only way to. And so one good thing about this conserve product I was telling you about is it's mostly just going to attack thrips. And it's also very safe as far as people too. So you might try it as well. But yeah, the main reason thrips are so difficult to control is just because unlike other pests, they're constantly flying in from the surrounding area.
They're all over in the front yard, backyard. And I'm so sick.
They're tough. And you might need to spray some of the surrounding plants too, especially if you're using something like conserve, which is more target specific, but that'll help too, kind of, you're not digging out just a cup of water, you're digging out, like a bucket, if you will.
Okay.
But the good thing about thrips is they're primarily an issue more in the growing season, so they should subside somewhat as it gets cooler.
Or will a freeze and cutting it close in February get rid of it?
They're ubiquitous. They're in nature. They'll always be there. But they do kind of ebb and flow depending on from year to year. So, but in the wintertime, they should really subside, if not almost disappear temporarily. But yeah, if you're just noticing this year, it probably just means you happen to have a really bad year, and most of the time they're not going to be that big of a deal.
Oh, may I ask?
Hi, I have a comment and a question.
Yes, ma'am.
This is Deb Pasco, Henderson County. First, I know this is like number 3 on the agenda originally, but I think this is a really great overview of everything that we're going to be talking about. So I'm really glad it was first.
Thanks.
And secondly, I'm on a Facebook group for Texas gardening. And several people have commented that their hydrangeas did bloom this year. So it's sort of a regional thing. Do you have any comment or opinion or insight on why that might have happened?
Not really. I'll be honest. And you're talking about the regular big leaf hydrangea, not the oak leaf, right? You're talking about the regular ones.
No, I think it's just, yeah, the regular ones, like, you know.
They're blue or pink.
Just regular. Yeah.
I don't know for sure. I have not heard that. But yeah, and I'm not really a hydrangea expert. I would think it may be something to do with temperature, probably. You might reach out and ask. Kim Benton is she's a very knowledgeable horticulturist, and she's also, she's really knows these Texas plants too. And she's, they're in Cherokee County. So I'd maybe try reaching out to her. She may have a good idea. Her name is Kim Benton, Benton, Benton.
And how do I get in touch with her?
I can give you her email address. Hang on just a second. Oh, hang on. Let me look at my email real quick. That'll probably make more sense anyways to pull it up. That way you can see it too.
Cherokee County website.
Yeah, you could look there too. Yeah.
To look where?
Cherokee County.
Cherokee County, okay.
Added that website to the chat box if you want to grab that address.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I had a composting question.
Yeah, go for it.
I have a lot of Mexican fan palms in my backyard, and I want to do. I need to just trim everything. So, is there an easier way to compost those because they're so fibrous, they're so thick? I've usually been just getting rid of them in the garbage, but I would like to compost them if it's possible.
So, sorry, I'm terrible at multitasking.
It's okay.
So the more you can shred them up, the smaller the pieces, the better. That's what I would say. If you can get a hold of some kind of shredder or something, or even cut them up, I would think you'd probably need to shred them almost to make them compost in any reasonable amount of time. Otherwise, you're probably going to have to, you could just pile them up somewhere and they're just going to take a long time to break down. But yeah, the more you can shred them, the more you can, increase the surface area of those pieces, the faster they're going to break down.
Okay, thank you.
Quit sharing your screen.
I'm sorry? Oh, I'm trying to find the chat. I'm not seeing it.
Oh, because you're sharing your screen. I don't know if you care.
I'm not worried about that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I have a question about aphids.
Okay.
So I'm growing peppers and I was growing okra this year, and I tried using neem oil and I just can't get rid of them. They come back over and over, and they're all underneath the leaves, and especially over the okra. It's a big problem. And I don't want to use conventional pesticides. I like to try to use organic and stuff that's safe for the environment and for my health and my pet's health. So I was wondering if you recommend anything on how to get rid of them, or will they just go away soon because we're moving to fall?
Okay. And just real quick, Adam, I just want to mention to everybody, I put Kim Benton, her email address in there in the chat box. So Adam, you said you have aphids on, you said like vegetables, like okra and stuff?
Well, I have chili peppers in my backyard and have some okra. Those were the main plants I had issues with aphids this year. And I had a lot, especially on the okra.
Usually aphids aren't too difficult to control compared to some other like thrips, for example, because they don't move in quite as quickly. So you said you used neem oil and what else?
That was the only thing I tried so far.
I mean, usually like insecticidal soaps will work pretty well too. You just the issue with like neem oil and insecticidal soap is you're actually you're suffocating basically those insects. You're clogging up the spiracles, and but you can also, you're doing that to some degree to the plant too, clogging up some of the stomates. And so you can actually burn them sometimes, especially when it's really hot. Trying to think what else. I mean, sometimes I'll just wash them off, will work pretty well too. Trying to think what else. You know, you could use the natural, if you want to try to stick with natural, you could use the natural pyrethrin, which is that's the natural form of it. It's not very long lasting. It doesn't have a long residual like permethrin or zeta pyrethrin and some of these other ones. But you could use that. I'm trying to think what else as far as, you know, there's rotenone too. I don't really, you gotta be careful. It's kind of, even though it's organic and natural, it's kind of, it's pretty toxic. But those are the main ones. I may be leaving something off, but, as far as organic.
Okay.
So, but yeah, they should also start to, well, I say they should start to subside, but I've had aphids on cabbage in January, even in some warm winters. But of course, your warm season stuff is probably going to start, you know, kind of, it won't be going too much longer anyway.
Okay. Yeah, it was a big problem this year. So hopefully I get another harvest before winter. Last year I had a harvest all the way into January.
Oh, wow. Wow. Must be pretty far south.
I'm in Fort Bend.
Oh, that's
Missouri.
right. Okay. Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Ask you something
Yes,
real
ma'am.
quick about aphids too.
Okay.
Because I've tried washing them off of my giant milkweed. I raise monarch butterflies, and so I'm
Ooh.
really careful about what I put on my plants. But I bought a giant milkweed, and it's covered in aphids. I've washed them off, and it seems like 2 or 3 days later they're back, even stronger and heavier, more infested. So is there something you would recommend that won't harm the caterpillars or the eggs, future eggs?
You know, not that I know of. I mean, you could, if you timed it right, you could use something, you know, like an insecticidal soap or something that's going to, a smothering kind of agent, a neem or something like that. But I'd be pretty careful. So probably what I would do is I'd probably, like you said, you know, try washing them off. And just, now there is, I don't remember the name of it, but there is a species of aphid that is specific to Asclepias, to milkweed. It's kind of orange, I think, in color. And that's just something you just kind of get with the plant. You know, they always go together, you know. And so if that's it, I wouldn't worry too much about it. But if it's like green peach aphid or something, yeah, you could try to wash them off. But yeah, I'd be pretty cautious about trying to use any kind of pesticide if you're doing monarchs.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question concerning compost.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guilty of this all the time. Say I go to the garden store and I get 3 bags of compost and I end up using 2. Well, there's 1 left over. The question is shelf life and storage, proper storage. Any suggestions?
Yeah, so I mean, compost is not really going to, eventually it's going to break down. It's going to kind of break down toward a state of being almost like humus or something like that, where it's not probably going to be quite as effective it's not going to have the same effect on soil structure, but it's still going to have a lot of the same nutrient stuff. So it's not really going to go bad per se. However, I wouldn't put it somewhere out like where it's going to get rained on a lot, because what can happen is if it rains a lot, you can have a lot of the nutrients that are in there, you know, your mineral nutrients, fertilizers, essentially get leached, get washed out. Now, I don't know that I would store it, depending on the compost. I would probably try to keep it where it's relatively cool or whatever, but still somewhat moist. Because sometimes some compost, if you let it really dry out, it gets hydrophobic when it's dry. It's really difficult to re-wet. But the main thing is I probably just wouldn't leave it to where it's going to get rained on, have a lot of water, potentially leach it out. So, but it's not really going to. I mean, what kind of time frame are you talking about? Years or months?
Oh, like a month or two.
Oh, no, I wouldn't worry about that at all. No. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not going to go bad on you or anything. I mean, it's a rotten material basically. You know, it's just going to rot down a little bit more. So.
Okay. So a good mulch has millions upon millions of little microbes living in there, right? So
are you talking about mulch or are you talking about compost?
Oh, I'm sorry, compost. My bad. Compost.
Oh,
yeah.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So I guess from that angle, that perspective, you know, I guess you could maybe punch some holes in the bag or make sure it doesn't get into an anaerobic state, because that's when you're making compost, you try to make sure you have enough air where you've got aerobic fermentation, because the anaerobic stuff, those are different microbes, and that's when you get the really just bad smells associated with composting. And they're probably, I don't know for sure, but I would think you're probably not going to get as much of the beneficial microbes either. So yeah, you might try punching some holes or something in it, or store it, maybe put it in a pot. I see what you're saying now, because you don't want it to get like completely. You don't want it to get really sour, and you don't want it to get to go anaerobic. You want it to be able to breathe a little bit.
Okay, great.
Good question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We're at 1 o'clock now. I don't mind staying.
I have this huge big gardenia. It's about probably 8 or 9 feet, and it gave me about hundreds of flowers. But when the flowers died, I noticed all the leaves are black. So I did the same thing, the insecticidal soap and the neem. And I used once that couple of times that acephate, which the local nursery recommended, but I think it's too toxic for me. I didn't.
Yeah, it's pretty nasty stuff.
Yeah, I'm going to do something with it. But what can I do now for those black leaves? I pruned it down. I removed a lot of the leaves. I just cut off a lot of the lower branches. So it's aerating better, but it's still black.
So when you say black, is it like a lesion on the leaf, or is it like some stuff is it some black powdery stuff that kind of can rub off if you really rub off?
The second, but the whole leaf is black.
Okay, if it rubs off, it sounds to me like you might have black sooty mold, which is in itself not bad, although it can block the light from photosynthesis. But the big thing is it's kind of a secondary disease, like you could call it a disease, a secondary issue that results from a bigger issue, and that is some type of piercing sucking insect, either an aphid, a scale, there's some other insects, mealybugs will do it. So you probably, if you're not seeing aphids or not noticing anything like that, you may look for scale, SCALE insect, scale insect. They're closely related to aphids and mealybugs and all that, leaf hoppers and stuff. And you might also try Googling scale and scale plus or scale and gardenia, because there's usually going to be several specific types of scale that are going to feed on that particular plant. And what that'll do, then you can familiarize yourself with what those scale look like, and then you'll hopefully be able to see them, because sometimes they really attach tightly to the stem or leaf, and sometimes they're difficult to see. But you can if you want to, I'd be happy to try to look at it if you want to send me pictures of it too.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you. Even the stems are turning kind of black.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you got black sooty mold growing on the honeydew, the excrement from one of these one of these insect pests. And what I always say is try to get a picture close up of the leaf,
Okay.
but also farther away of the whole plant too, just so I get a better idea, kind of the overall health and everything of the plant.
Great. Thank you so much. I truly enjoyed this talk.
Oh, thank you. Well, hopefully we'll get it figured out.
Okay,
One
thanks.
quick question, if I may, just as a follow-up.
Sure.
Thank you on the conversion for the sprinkler system.
Uh-huh.
The one question that I do have, do you have a source, like a sprinkler warehouse or something like that you might recommend? I mean, this sounds like a project that I might be able to do.
Yeah.
So is there a place you can use where you get discounted materials? I see somebody raising their hand.
No. So where are you located, sir?
I'm in Fort Bend, Katy.
Okay. So yeah, talk to Margot, talk to Boone. You're going to have a Ewing irrigation dealer down there somewhere, EWING,
Right.
Ewing. And there are some other irrigation suppliers out there. I'm by no means am I saying only go to them, but they'll have a lot more selection on what you can get, and then also their prices are usually pretty good too. And you don't have to be a commercial person; you can just walk in as a homeowner and